This is the section on materiality, constructing social relationships, and meanings with things. We're going to consider the questions: why is the ownership of artifacts from other cultures a contentious issue? How can anthropology help us understand objects? How do meanings of things change over time? And how do objects come to represent our goals and aspirations? The image on the slide is an object that appeared as a part of the Into the Heart of Africa exhibit, which opened on November 16th, 1989, and closed on August 6th, 1990, at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. It is a gold necklace made by an unidentified Ashanti artist, believed to have been created around 1874. The Asante people who reside in what is now known as modern-day Ghana. Our learning objectives here, when we talk about what is the role of objects and material culture in constructing social relationships and cultural meanings. In responding to this overarching question, you should be able to clarify the difference between thinking of the arts solely as a realm of creative expression and a broader anthropological interest in understanding the social dynamics of objects. Second, identify the multiple social dimensions of human-made objects. Third, explain how and why objects have social lives or forms, uses, and trajectories that are intertwined in people's lives in complex ways. And the fourth objective is to summarize how people use objects to channel desires, aspirations, and consumption patterns, as well as to manipulate other people. Why is the ownership of artifacts from other cultures a contentious issue? If you look at the photo that is on this slide and are familiar with the movie Black Panther, this is a scene where Eric Killmonger comes into it's a fictional museum at that point, and he looks at the artifacts that are there that are from Africa, and he questions the right of this particular museum, that I think the setting is in Britain, Great Britain, as to the right that they have to collecting and keeping these artifacts. The international scramble for objects from societies around the world that Western scholars thought of as, quote, primitive, unquote, began in the early 20th century. These objects, which documented the lives, economic activities, and rituals of, quote, native populations, unquote, meant different things to the museums than they did to those who actually used them. The larger collection of these exotic objects meant greater distinction or prestige between one museum and another, and ownership was viewed as belonging to the individual museums. There was a lot of competition in those days between museums as to who could have and own the greatest collection of exotic objects. Questions of ownership rights and protection. Groups as AIM, laws as NAGPRA, and programs such as UNESCO's World Heritage Sites program address questions of repatriation, restoration, and preservation. Ultimately, enduring questions remain in regard to material culture around the world. Some of these enduring questions include: shouldn't the people whose direct ancestors made or used collected objects have some rights over them? Who had the right to sell these objects to museums in the first place? Who has the moral right to display and interpret them? Do the museums who own these objects have the right to say whatever they want about another culture's objects? Or should the people from whom the objects were collected have a say. Cultural resource management. It's a term that you will find a lot in applied anthropology in general. But it's a form of applied anthropology. But cultural resource management is not just for archaeologists. It's concerned with how to protect and manage cultural resources of every community, especially important prehistoric sites and cultures. It works to document and interpret historic and prehistoric sites and structures for living communities. How can anthropology help us understand objects? Before fieldwork became central to cultural anthropology, scholars studied isolated objects removed from their dynamic cultural context. We talk about armchair anthropology, this being a dynamic. When anthropologists began conducting ethnographic fieldwork, the deeper meaning of objects became evident. The many dimensions of objects. In 1985, George W. Stocking Jr. proposed 7 dimensions of objects: height, width, depth, time in terms of history, power, wealth, aesthetics. When we take into consideration these things, height, width, and depth, can talk about the physical measurements. Time in terms of history, where the individual object came from, how interpretations have changed through time. Power, inequality reflected by objects. Many non-Western objects collected during the colonial period reside in ethnographic museums, but non-Western cultures rarely have museums of European and American objects. Wealth, displays of wealth, and social status. Many priceless artifacts are possessed by individuals not descended from the peoples that produced them. And then finally, aesthetics, or recognition that different individuals and groups find different patterns aesthetically pleasing. Let's talk about the analysis of a bicycle. How do we analyze a bicycle? First, a bicycle has physical dimensions. It must be used by an average-sized human, but it may also be viewed as an expression of artistry. History. This particular bike reflects the history of all bicycles, necessary to arrive at this modern conception of a bicycle. What associations does the bike's owner have with it in terms of memories, values, and so on? The bike is also a commodity, part of a complex economic system. We can talk about it in terms of power and also wealth. Additionally, who can own a bike? What might owning a particular bike say about the individual versus buying a different bike? Its parts were likely manufactured in other parts of the world. Who produced it? Who was in charge? So the bike's presence here reflects a journey. We could talk about aesthetics, or the different ways in bikes appear, the colors, the design. If you think about, for many of us, when we were growing up, we might have decorated our bikes, put things on it, added things to it, or all of those kinds of things in terms of aesthetics. And then finally, if we talk in just straight terms, the bike is practically useful as a mode of transportation. We now consider the power of symbols. Different traditions make use of unknown, at least to us, cosmology, gods, ghosts, spirits, and other supernatural beings. Modern Christians have never seen figures like God, Moses, Jesus, angels, or Satan, but most have visualizations of these things based on their historical depictions in Judeo-Christian art. This is an Nkisi figure from the Hood Museum of Art from Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire. When Western audiences were first introduced to objects like the Nkisi figure from the Democratic Republic of Congo, they often responded dismissively and ethnocentrically. They misunderstood African notions of aesthetics. In this Nkisi figure, displayed at the Hood Museum, each additional element adds meaning and power to the object. The most important here are the nails. Each nail pounded into the carving represented some favor from the spirit in this figure, and it also strengthened the spirit. Here, if we look at in Papua New Guinea, the Barjani's bowler hat. A century earlier, a religious prophet named Barjani foretold the arrival of Europeans. When Barjani died, the other members of his clan established a shrine in his honor. When one of our authors, Robert Welsh and John Terrell, went to see the shrine, it held an old Charlie Chaplin-style bowler hat. This seemingly out-of-place object had great significance. It was Barjani's hat, and as a European hat, a reminder of his prediction.